Breathe Me by R.T. Chapter 1. I ran inside, not waiting for an invitation. The circumstances were unique enough not to warrant a knock on the door, and the pungent smell of a curse was present from beyond the gates. When I entered, Faye was waiting with her 4-year-old daughter, Emma, tight in her arms. Emily briefed me on the state of things already, so I ran as fast as the merciless month of December allowed me. But my habit of wearing dresses all year round put me at a considerable disadvantage. The situation was not at all a good one. A mysterious young woman knocked on the Westgrove family's door at the crack of dawn, asking for Faye's husband. "Do you recognize her? Have you ever seen her before?" I asked, trying to catch my breath. "No, I haven't. She presented herself as a friend of Charles, so I let her in. By the time I went upstairs, she was gone." "It's 5 a.m, Faye, in Flintvale, out of all places. An odd time for any sort of visit from anyone." Irritation laced my voice rather with worry than annoyance. I felt slightly disappointed that she did not, for 1 second, think something was off and that maybe she should not have let any stranger inside of the house. Flintvale was a sheltered community. Very few knew we existed. Visitors were scarce, and unknown faces rarely made appearances. "Why would you let her in?" I asked, still trying to control my tone. "She said she had an urgent message to pass on to Charles." "Elisa, what was I to do?" Faye asked. "What if she was dangerous?" "She looked nothing like a hag. She was very pleasant-looking." Faye paused abruptly. I could tell that she was holding something back. "What is it, Faye?" "Well, it's silly, and it's probably just my mind making things up." "It's not your mind. That's your intuition that saw something that you didn't. Faye, I need to know." "Well, it's just her appearance. It still has me very unsettled. The girl was almost too beautiful, like the girls you see at the carnivals. Her features were so exotic and hard to forget. Eyes just too big, and her upper lip considerably fuller than the lower one. It made her hypnotically exquisite. It was a truth universally known that hags were ugly creatures, but those who were just in transition could sometimes hide their disfigurements, so it could have been potentially difficult to recognize a young one. However, for an inexperienced hag to expose herself right after committing an offense was very unusual and very dangerous. The universe had repercussions for every casted curse, and one would not want to be seen when the punishment occurred. "You might be right. I don't think that she was a hag. Someone else must have been with her." "What else did she say?" I asked. Faye closed her eyes to concentrate, then spoke. "I cannot remember exactly, but she mentioned something about dues Charles had to pay." "Was there anything else?" "No," Faye responded hesitantly. I shook my head in frustration, for it was not exactly much to go on. "Where's Charles?" "In there," she pointed down the hall. In the parlor, her husband sat in an armchair, lighting up an early cigarette. "Good morning, Charles," I greeted him without enthusiasm. "I thought you were done vexing hags." Charles only laughed at my remark, but his joy quickly evaporated once Faye started crying. She had joined us in the room, still cradling her child, burdened by her husband's lack of interest in the situation. "Take him upstairs with you. I'll be there in a minute," I said to Faye, getting a bit irritated myself now. When I was sure that Faye was far enough not to hear us, I felt free to give Charles a piece of my mind. "I don't know what you did, but this was the last straw you pulled with me. Do you have any idea what danger your ignorance brings upon the family?" I snapped, but still tried to keep my voice low. "You are lovely in the morning, Elisa. Has anyone told you that?" "Exquisitely charming," Charles said. "Cut down on the sarcasm. Your foolishness had Emma hexed, and right now I need you to grow a pair and admit it. Faye was the closest thing that I ever had to a family, so not letting my disapproval of Charles' actions drive a wedge between us was typically my priority, but now he crossed a boundary that I could no longer ignore. "Where did you find this one?" I snapped, unable to keep my composure anymore, as it was too early for me to deal with this man's disposition courteously. "There was a village just outside of Callaway." He barely finished his first cigarette when he lit up the next one. "Keep it simple and sweet, Charles. I don't want to know the details," I quickly added as an early warning, but he just rolled his eyes at me and kept talking. "Everyone and their mother claimed to be some sort of soothsayer, diviner, and every other nonsense under the sun. Half of them couldn't even tell a cow from a horse, let alone cast hexes." Well, obviously the other half could, otherwise I wouldn't be here, I hissed through my teeth. Charles smiled again, and I shook my head in disbelief. Cheeky git, I mutter under my breath. There were a lot of small villages hidden all around the mountains surrounding us. The only two cities that were in close proximity were not very big. The only two cities that were close in proximity were not very big or eventful either, which led to other people finding new ways of entertaining themselves. Over the years, that brought a very high rise of fraudulent tarot readers whose natural talents laid in the arts of deception. Self-proclaimed soothsayers that were gifted in saying what you wanted to hear, giving a false sense of comfort, making you unknowingly run into the arms of evil with their ignorance. And the other spectrum, the good sayers who promised to shower you with luck and fortune in exchange for everything in your pocket. Naturally, due to these con artists, the very few of us who were truly gifted were shoved to the side and disregarded. Credibility vanished. Communities became deeply divided. Therefore, when the real evil reached one's unfortunate soul, anyone who still believed no longer had the courage to ask for help or didn't know who they could trust, and those who didn't believe just suffered in silence without even bothering to ask for anything at all. For Charles, coming into possession of this knowledge was the beginning of a very deep rabbit hole he chose to dive into. The more he found out about this side of the world, the more it took over his mind and soul. Ultimately, he discovered the real evil, hidden under the blanket of lies and deception. Hags, a forgotten creature that enriched the mythologies of many nations throughout the centuries, all of which had different depictions and ideologies. In our culture, which these myths were still alive and believed in, the word hagi or hag was used to describe the wizened old woman who did curses and hexes. Devilish women, hags were always ugly and repulsive in their appearance, as the main rule of their dark practices was that every evil that they cast on others would return through some form of evil disfigurement. In other parts of the country, people considered hags to be just old witches, much more akin to the supernatural entities like fairies or goddesses, but still believed them to be nothing more than tales meant to scare children and entertain adults. Reality, however, was much grimmer. The hags from our folklore were very real, causing pain and suffering wherever they went, seeking revenge for the smallest wrongdoings. They were very skilled in finding weakness and creating disasters. With the population growing more and more skeptical of the existence of extra-mundane creatures and occurrences, hags had a perfect veil under which they could operate. A woman born with the power of haggery had no choice in the matter. The gene was present, and once she would cast her first hex or curse, there was no way of stopping the process. Our folklore also believed hags to be very vain and narcissistic women with an obsession for their own reflection, a trait that was as much their weakness as it was their source of power, since there was another urge that was bestowed upon these creatures, the need to cause pain equally strong to their egotistical wishes. Unfortunately, by the time a woman had committed enough atrocities to gain the hag title, she had no beauty left for the universe to take. The only way hags could soothe their sorrow then was by consuming other people's misery and sadness. It was an endless and vicious cycle that needed balancing out to keep these women from causing uncontrollable disasters. But over the years, society grew more skeptical of the existence of anything beyond what they could prove with science and logic, outnumbering those whose beliefs were still intact. Therefore, it became a lot easier for hags to get away with this despicable behavior. Charles called it legal murder. People were dying unexplained, strange deaths. Never any suspects, but always the same stories of encounters with an old, ugly woman. No justice court would have ever ruled a homicide as killed by hex. And though the universe had a perfectly good way of keeping things in balance, for Charles, who was a lawyer, that wasn't enough. "It's not a big deal. No serious harm has ever been done," Charles then said, looking at me with a carefree expression. "Amelia told me that Emma woke up screaming her lungs out before she lost her voice entirely, yet you don't see any issue with that? You have a problem, Charles." I turned around before he had a chance to respond and left to find Faye and her daughter. I intercepted Amelia at the foot of the stairs, and she pointed me to the right room. The big house, as we would call it, was the largest property in Flintvale. Inside was even grander than what the outside showed, and the spectacular stairs looked like they belonged in a castle. I was, however, familiar with the house and moved with ease, finding Emma's room without a problem. I knocked lightly on the open door. Faye seemed to be so preoccupied with Emma's needs that she failed to hear me coming, so I didn't want to startle her by entering without a warning. "Are you all right?" I asked, gently petting Faye's arm. She only nodded, but looked down to conceal the worry in her soul. That didn't help, as I still saw not only her aura, but felt the air around her, burdened with pains only a loving mother could know. Wanting to ease her sorrow, I hurried up, scanning the little girl's energy threads, looking for any sign of the hex or curse. "Emma is fine," I tried to reassure, but quickly grimaced at my remark, realizing that it came off as very wrong, as the child was not at all fine. "I think it was an object-bound curse. I don't sense any evil on Emma's person." "Object-bound? What sort of object?" Faye's tone changed between sad and desperate with every sentence, and I felt deep sympathy for my deepest friend, who found herself in such a defenseless and exceptional situation. It could be anything, but curses leave threads behind. I just need to get close enough to the item to see them. I saw Faye nod, and a flicker of hope sparked in her soul. I felt a wave of worry, for there was a chance, a very big chance, that even if I found what I was looking for, I was not going to be capable of reversing it. I remembered a case similar to this one, but that was a particularly gruesome occasion that was performed by a very old and very sick hag, whose life was coming to an end, so she had no fear of consequences. I could only hope that this was something else, something more forgiving, and with that hope lit, I proceeded to spend the entirety of that morning looking for any object that seemed out of place or suspicious. I was never fond of big houses, mansions, villas, or other glamorous buildings where it took you a whole minute to walk from one side to the other. I just couldn't see the appeal of a home that resembled a museum. And now, in particular, this aversion of mine for large houses has intensified as I had to palpate every inch of every hallway looking for heaven knows what. Most of the rooms were locked, so Emma wouldn't wander or get lost, something I would have to thank Faye for, as it saved me a great deal of time. Every door in this house was made of solid heavy wood and would be absolutely impossible to force open. No hag would have gone through that much trouble. Making my way down, I walked past Charles, who was pacing up and down the corridor in slow, steady steps. I ignored him, even when he asked me a question, and kept on moving anything around that could be moved. By the time I finished with the entire house, I was at a loss, wondering if I should just start again, if I had perhaps missed something. My feet were aching, and my arms felt weak from all of the furniture's pulling and lifting, so I sat down on the windowsill in the hallway, wondering what would be the wisest to do next. It was getting rather bright outside, and the snow was reflecting a harsh white light. The heavy storm last night covered everything so evenly it was difficult to tell anything apart. Even the rose garden was lost beneath a blanket of white. I stared at a particular patch of land for a very long time. Placed right at the entrance of the property, it offered a grand welcome in the warmer seasons, but I could feel how my senses and intuition were picking up on something and were waiting for my mind to make the connection too. And soon enough, it did. The rose garden, of course. That's why I felt it from outside already. There was never anything inside the house to begin with. I grabbed my long coat and ventured out into the cold, trying to visualize the threads I was looking for. Healers saw the world inherently different from anyone else. For us, air did not look like an empty space. It was an exceptional web of energy lines, waves, and vibrations, each in their own place. Every thread had a different shade of the same color, golden or yellow. The only exceptions were the hags, whose threads and actions were dark gray or black, but regardless of the color, they all had a purpose and role. Feelings, both emotional and physical, thoughts directed toward others, decisions and memories, they all showed somewhere in the maze of threads. For the untrained eye of a young healer like myself, this was just an overwhelming jungle, a mess designed to bring you to despair. Luckily, the threads I was looking for would stand out brilliantly in the current conditions. Like a dense black smoke stretched into a rope, there it was, floating in mid-air behind some sturdy pine trees. After such a long search, excitement should have taken over, but instead, I felt my stomach tighten. The thread ended somewhere not too far from the forest, where a patch of land looked like it had been recently dug up. I set off to the gardener's house to ask for help, or a spade at least. Mr. Heff was not particularly pleased with my request, as he was a profoundly religious man and believed that anyone who meddled in these things was in some sort of camaraderie with Satan himself. Consequently, he was happy to offer me a shovel, but less so his help. Mr. Heff, his wife, Margaret, and his children, James and Emily, all lived on the West Crow property rent-free. As such, he was forced to be sort of polite to Fay and Charles, but never really bothered with me. Mr. Heff was a right figure, too. Unlike his family, who are decent humans, he was a grouchy old man who just really hated people. Unfortunately, when Mr. West Crow Sr. had bought the big house for his son, Charles, the woman who sold it to him would only do so with the condition that Mr. Heff and his family remained in their old posts and house on the property. A contract was made to assure that these conditions were respected, and at the time it sounded like a swell idea, until Mr. Heff's personality started shining through. I'll say a prayer for you, Miss May. Maybe God will forgive your offsprings because you are way past saving. I had to contain my amusement as I found Mr. Heff's passionate belief that I was absolutely going to hell without a shred of doubt rather humorous. I thanked him for the gardening tool and apologized for bothering him, then returned to the forest. Luckily, the hole was fresh enough that the ground hadn't had time yet to freeze up. But digging any amount of dirt in a dress and a coat was the peak of inconvenience. The mud and snow soaked into the fabric, and I shivered every time the heavy, cold edges of my skirt touched my legs. But the news was all too bad as I reached the certain depth in the ground. Symbolically, anything deeper than I was held a grave for once living souls. Horror had colored my expression before I had seen anything, as the threads of the hex became darker in color. Then one last shovel of earth discovered a scene that had me running back to the house. My breathing was labored as I spoke, but I forced myself to sound calm for the sake of Fay and Emma. Get the child and go to Mrs. Westcrow. Say nothing to no one and avoid the priest. He'll know something is wrong. Charles and I will follow once the grounds are clean, I said to Fay. She looked shocked and was not moving, waiting for an explanation. You must trust me on this one. I will explain later, but you have to go, now. She only nodded this time and took off together with Emily, the maid. After they were gone, I charged at Charles and grabbed him by the shirt. Charles, you dumb gobermouch, you pissed off the wrong hag. This might be the stupidest thing you've pulled so far. The grin Charles had earlier this morning was now gone. I took a step back and went to the hallway. Get dressed, walk with me, I said as I threw his coat at him. I led him out to the yard, behind the rose garden, and behind the trees to the cursed place. Go on, take a look, I said, daring. Charles eyed me very cautiously, then walked up to see for himself. Almost instantly, he pulled back, gasping. 4 lambs' heads lay in a circle, their mouths tied shut with wires. That requires a very dark soul, Charles. Someone who doesn't fear pain or death. Someone who has done this before and whose soul is so far beyond repair that they have nothing to lose. This sort of practice always has a price to pay by those who indulge in the act. The universe does not take a loss of life lightly, be it human or otherwise. Charles, this is a serious matter. I've seen this particular curse before. This time, Emma got off easy. Call it a gentle warning. I don't understand, Elisa, he said in a soft voice. It is a muting curse, Charles. She will not speak a word for as many years as she is old. That's how the curse is read. Emma will not talk for the next 4 years. Well, surely there is a way to undo it. Take the wires off, burn them, drown them. You will sort it out, won't you, Elisa? Charles' tone was calm and composed, like this wasn't a serious thing, like it was a daily occurrence that could be fixed at a snap of the finger. I flamed up inside in anger. The air around me heated up significantly. Charles must have felt it too as he took a step back. I breathed in deeply to regain composure, but it didn't work as well as I'd hoped. They should have sewn your bloody mouth shut. I'm not sure what studies you were doing, but you might want to revise, as I don't think you are looking in the right place. Perhaps this time the seriousness of things will hit you before I do. He rolled his eyes at me, knowing that I couldn't follow through with my promise even if I meant it. I had to turn away to compose myself again. You mentioned that you had seen this before, he said, while taking a fearless step toward me. I have. A long time ago. That case, however, was more unfortunate. The man in question was 42 at the time. That meant 42 years of him unable to speak. 42 dead creatures. Elisa, what are you telling me? Finally, it seemed like the gravity of the situation was reaching Charles. You just condemned your own daughter to almost half a decade of silence. The consequences of your foolish recklessness, chasing hags like a mindless teenager who just found out the tooth fairy is real. And you really can't do anything? He asked again, this time visibly distraught. Would do no good. The poor creatures had their mouths wired shut when they were alive. That's just a symbol of guidance to show the intention, the direction of the curse. Then the animal is forever silenced by having its throat cut. None of those actions can be reversed, therefore the curse can't be either. You need to stop this madness right now, Charles. You need to end whatever research you're conducting. It is getting out of hand. I don't think I can, Elisa. Not anymore. I don't think I would want to either. I feel for once that my research is leading me in the right direction, he said, but I could have sworn I sensed a wave of dishonesty in his words. It wasn't necessarily unusual, though. It was, after all, my request to be kept in the dark, so he would often leave out details on purpose. But this time, it felt a bit different. I didn't dwell on it too much, though, fearing involvement. Not sure who or what you're looking for, but it's not worth it at the expense of Emma and Faye, and you must agree with me. Charles nodded as he responded. You're absolutely right. It's not, and that is the exact reason why I must ask you a favor. You better be bloody taking the mick, Charles, I said in disbelief. Adelie, please, you must listen. I made a mistake, yes, but it was a very unlikely mistake. It will not happen again. If I can prove my current findings to the world, to the court, then that would... Excuse me? I yelled when I realized what he was saying. Tell me you are not serious. Tell me I understand. Tell me I misunderstood. Are you trying to reintroduce witch trials? Are you barking mad, Charles? Must I lecture you on how many innocent people have died at the ignorant hands of your judicial system? Humans are not equipped to give judgment on things of this sort. Nor is your system. I know that hags will eventually get punished, but the way the universe works, it's flawed too. Hags receive their punishment throughout and at the end of their life, but they are still free to roam around and do further damage. Just like you said once, eventually they lose so much they don't care for doomsday. Does anyone else know about this, Charles? Did you tell anyone besides me? I demanded, almost in desperation. Some people, but only those I know that I can trust. If what you're saying is right, and pray to your God it isn't, you just wrote your death sentence, Charles, yours and your family's. And I will most definitely not have a hand in it. I cannot help you anymore, not as long as you are so determined to rain hell down on the people you love. Coincidentally, they are also the ones I love, and if that means protecting Faye and Emma from you, then I will do it without hesitation. Do you understand that? I'm not negotiating this, Elisa. I need to leave. Regardless of what you think of me, I am doing this to protect my family and the future generations that are to come. I just do it in my own way. I see things differently than you, Elisa, on a bigger scale, beyond just my own house, beyond this village or the city or even the country. You see me endangering my family. I see it as saving it and many others down the road. I will not allow anyone to frighten me into not doing the right thing. There wouldn't be any need to save anyone if you wouldn't have purposefully run after hags for a decade. Charles ignored me and continued. I need to go to Callaway for a couple of days. I snuck a letter to Amelie this morning and instructed her to give it in full confidence to Mother. I asked her in that letter to have Emma and Faye stay there while I'm gone, so that they would be closer to you and the Forest House. Does Faye know about any of this? About how this is no longer a hobby but an insane obsession that you are prepared to die for if necessary? You are overreacting, Elisa. No one is dying. Charles was almost annoyed now. Am I? Why aren't you? It's your family that's pulling the short end of the stick here, Charles. He said nothing, and I just dropped it. He was quite clearly prepared for such a scenario and wasn't going to budge. He knew how dangerous this could all be. But I have been running low on patience with people lately and had no more power to argue with the deaf. After we cleaned up, Charles wanted to leave straight away. I pulled him back by the sleeve of his coat. You will come to Mr. Westgrove's with me now, Charles, I said sternly. Elisa, please. Understand, I have to go as soon as possible, he said. Here is what you don't understand, Charles. I will drag you to Faye's feet with my own hands if I have to, and you know very damn well if that happens, you will have no choice but to follow me like the dog you are. But I will not be the one who breaks the wonderful news to your wife. You will look her in the eyes and tell her you are leaving. Then you can explain the Emma situation too. Or do it in whatever order you want. Just do it yourself. He took a minute to digest my words, but unlike my earlier threats, these were very real. I had a hidden talent, one that I rarely used, and that was to summon people. I learned how to weave the threads of their souls together with mine. When I would, the other person would have no choice but to follow everywhere I was. They felt pulled toward me like gravity. It was a feeling impossible to break unless the thread was untangled. Charles knew this, so I was hoping by forcing him to face Faye that he would lose the will to leave. I was hoping that if he saw the pain in her eyes, that he would stop this circus. When we got to the other West Crow residence, Faye opened the door for us. "Oh, Elisa, Charles," she exclaimed in relief. I tried to ignore the glimmer of hope in her eyes. It killed me to see it, knowing what was about to happen. "How's Emma?" I asked instead. "She still hasn't said a word. Elisa, please talk to me. What is happening?" I looked over to Charles, not saying anything, then gave Faye a quick hug before I left them alone. I couldn't bear to see her suffer. I was going to have to deal with the aftermath anyway, so I at least hoped not to witness the storm.